maybe you can see that I have a mask, and that there are two screens on me, one, big and one just on my face. And the reason why we are using this platform, which is Collaborate, is not just because we are trying to avoid big tech, but also because this is part of my course of data sustainability. So I'm very happy to host today, to be with you today, the second edition of Data Sustainability Conference and the second edition of my course. This is the last day. So with these students that you cannot see, I will try to show you the students just for 1 second. They are all here. I don't know if you can see them. Basically, we are trying to address this issue of data sustainability under the ambiguity also of the concept of sustainability. So while more people are joining, I will just take 5 minutes to do a recap to the main taking that we built together at lessons, but also to introduce a bit where we were left last year with the first edition of Data Sustainability Conference. And I want to thank again the great speakers we have this year, extremely diverse and super stellar. So just starting, I would like to start with this provocation. There was this article by Omri Ben-Shahar on Journal of Legal Analysis on data pollution, and some take home from him. Basically, he said, digital information is the fuel of the new economy, but like the old economy is carbon fuel, it also pollutes. And so there are data emissions related to digital ecosystem. Basically, it challenges the hegemony of the prevailing view that the injuries from digital data enterprises are exclusively private. Basically, privacy is not a private problem, right? Privacy is a collective problem. And so he proposed to analyze the tools used to control industrial pollution, also to govern data protection. He's not the only one. Actually, we have other groups. Oops, there was disruption in my presentation. Yeah, because I see from two screens. So other great scholars that were addressing the comparison between data and wastes. And so the impact of data and the impact of wastes. Just in few words, and then there is a delay, I think, in the second screen, but we are working with that. We have many devices here. So I think that the main point here is what Daniel Solov was suggesting as the limitations of privacy rights. It was just 10 days ago, he wrote basically what all these people say, that privacy cannot be protected by focusing solely on the atomistic individual. Personal data of many people is interrelated, and people's decision about their own data have implications for the privacy of other people. So we have been reasoning of data processing like toxic waste. What I would like to do, and I already tried to do last year, is to overturn the narrative. So if data processing is like toxic waste processing, data protection should be like anti-pollution law. So sustainability should be built on this comparison between environmental ecosystem and data ecosystem. They are both affordances. They both delimit the capabilities and impact of economic activities in the digital and physical world. Sustainability basically from Latin means support, tolerate, and so in a way, it's to coexist despite something. So also the capacity for the internet businesses and data privacy to coexist. We usually know this graph as the sustainability graph. What we can try to do is to substitute data to environment, and to substitute in the general description of sustainable development, the data sustainable development. And basically, what will be this about? We're not the first to compare sustainability to data protection. Even the UN mentioned public access to information and fundamental freedoms as basis for sustainability and for economic growth. Amartya Sen was one of them who was just defining how basically we cannot have progress and economic efficiency without freedoms. And he mentioned freedoms like political, economic, social opportunities, and so on, but we can add data protection, right? So basically there is an interdependence between environmental protection and data protection. And also, protecting data and protecting societal values means that we protect actually democracy, non-discrimination, and fair justice. But the goal here is to prove that it can be economically efficient, because I mean, this might seem obvious, but we should think that privacy is an ally of businesses, because it announces trust, accuracy, integrity, and security. So data sustainability means protecting at the same time societal values, data, personal data, and also having economic efficiency in a way. And all these values are well connected to data protection principles. These are just some examples of connections. And so also negative externalities. Negative effect on a third party can be the environment, but also data privacy as a collective and individual concept. So, and the law can create a burden on companies to internalize the cost of their impact on these goods. And we have similar tools. We have the impact assessment that is learned from environmental law, and also the certifications. So just to conclude, I mean, I wanted to just, I go back the floor to Alessandra, but I wanted to say that I'm extremely happy to have our three speakers because they have three different perspectives. Ben Wagner was building the Sustainable Media Lab. And it's extremely interesting for us how media and sustainability should be connected. Christian Kuna, in his past history at the EDPS, was working with the previous EDPS, Giovanni Buttarelli, in which environmental sustainability was considered, for whom environmental sustainability was considered a key aspect also of the, sustainable data environment. And there are, as Alessandra was saying, these two aspects, so environmental and data. And also Ivana, with her double role of researcher in a big internet institute and also chief global privacy officer of a very big company processing data and technology. She also is wondering with these tensions. So I will mute, sorry, I took too many minutes, but I wanted to just be sure that you're all on the same page. Now I will stop my screen sharing and I will give the floor back to Alessandra. And thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Gian Claudio, for this introduction. So now let's explain a bit how this event works. So we will do a first round of intervention from our panelists. First, they will comment on the idea of sustainability in the AI sector, because indeed the AI sector raises specific challenges comparing with the GDPR and other areas with data protection law. So we would like to hear their point of view on about what are the major challenges to achieve data sustainability in the AI sector. Are the principles running the idea of sustainable data processing sufficient? And what could be the specificities of the idea of data sustainability in the AI sector, if any? So I will, after a first round of comments, I will then move on the second part of the panel that is about environmental sustainability in the AI sector, but we will talk about this later. So now I will give the floor to Ben. So Ben, can you hear us? Okay. Thank you very much, Ben, for sharing your perspective. Indeed, yes, myself, for personal academic research interest, I am investigating smart cities, and also in that aspect, the sustainability of smart cities is often interpreted rather in this environmental sense, but of course, as data protection scholars, we know that this is absolutely insufficient, limited angle to look at the subjects. So thank you very much for your perspective on that. And now I would like to pass the floor to Christian, so he can provide us some point of view from an institutional perspective. Let's put it like that. Christian, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks very much for inviting me. This is a really important topic, something that I feel very passionately about. And as Gian Claudio mentioned, I worked on this in my previous role at EDPS. With Giovanni Buttarelli. I'm not really going to speak on behalf of the Commission, if that's okay, because the Commission is doing lots of things. I'm not personally involved in the in AI policy as such. As you know, there's the AI Act proposal, which is making its way through the legislative process. And my colleagues in DG Connector are in the lead on that. I am working on data strategy and on the Data Act, which you should be seeing as a new Commission proposal very soon, next week. And all of these things are connected because AI is about inputs and outputs, and the most one of the most important input is probably data, along with proprietary algorithms and the human talent that goes into it. But I mean, I want to talk more from a more personal level on what I understand to be sustainability, and I think that is the crucial term that we need to be using. Now, we were trying to draw the link, Giovanni Buttarelli and I, towards the end, right at the end of his life, the notion of data practices, and in many ways, the discourse around artificial intelligence has replaced the earlier public debate about big data round about the year sort of 2016, 2017. Now what you're hearing is something else. It's Web3, it's crypto, etc., decentralization. But really we're talking about the same thing, which is very resource intensive operations which have an impact on the Earth's physical environment, on the atmosphere through pollution, and also on people, because these technologies rely on the extraction of data about people, their behavior, and then in turn those technologies are then used to somehow influence people and nudge or compel them to do things that they may or may not want to do. So the question is, to what extent the current approach to digitalization is sustainable. Is it sustainable from an environmental perspective, and is it sustainable from a human rights perspective and from a perspective of social justice? I think this was alluded to earlier, but those three things really need to be working together. And in the manifesto that Giovanni published posthumously at the end of 2019, I think there was a very deep engagement with the interaction between these different concerns about justice, concerns about individual rights, and about the impact that digitalization is having on the environment. And there was a call in there for I'll read a quote from it, that personal data generation does not serve democratically mandated public interests or empower people. Where the personal data generation does not serve democratically mandated public interests or empower people, it should be treated like data pollution that has a real life impact on society and the environment. And therefore incentive structures need to be re-engineered. It shouldn't be profitable, whether in the form of revenue per click or leaps in share prices for privacy to be abused. But all too often it is. And there is a fundamental problem when high-income countries like Belgium in Europe have a per capita material carbon footprint which is 60% higher than upper middle income countries and 13 times higher than low income countries. So really we need to have a sense of scale. We need to acknowledge the fact that these problems of how data is being processed are not equally distributed across the planet. And then finally we need to start to engage with perhaps a difficult truth for those of us working in the human rights environment, which is that human rights, certainly originally sort of post 1945, were not conceived as a means of protecting groups of people or whole societies, and certainly not the environment. They were conceived to protect the individual, and there's scholarship out there indicates that the conservative authors of today's human rights framework were basically trying to establish a bulwark against Bolshevism. Now, where does that leave us? That means that we need to try to integrate what we're doing in terms of protecting human rights with what we're doing on social justice and on the protection of the environment. Those are just some initial thoughts on this subject.
Okay. Thank you very much, Christian, for this perspective. Of course, we know that you cannot speak in the name of the Commission, but it was still very much interesting for us to emphasize how all these proposals for data governance are interconnected and with the artificial intelligence regulation. And thank you also for remembering the manifesto of Giovanni of 2019. So, yes, indeed, this aspect of social justice in the data protection discourse is very much neglected in most cases. It's something that we can acknowledge. But yeah, sorry, I will stop to comment on that, and I think that I will pass the floor to Ivana, that will have very much interesting to share, because I mean, she has a business perspective, but not only. So I think she will be elaborate a lot on this idea of sustainability of AI sector. Thank you, Ivana. The floor.
Thank you so much, and apologies, I've got a bit of a cold, so if I sound a bit quirky, I'm a bit congested, but it's not COVID. At least is a relief. So I just wanted, it was really, really interesting, and Ben, Christian, thank you so much for sharing these insights, because I had in mind some things to say, but actually you've really stimulated some of my thinking in this. So I think, and especially this sort of sharing the manifesto that you wrote with Giovanni, Christian, because it's sort of this overarching global approach to data sustainability, and that is, I think, is really, really important. So I think I just wanted to just touch on a few points. And I think this is a conversation that very much we need to have around the wider sustainability concept. And I agree with Ben that there is a lot that we need to understand, and there is a lot that we need to really narrow and define. But I just wanted to focus on a few points around sort of the sustainability argument. So I think we need to understand, and we need to focus on the situation that we're in now, you know, where we are in this sort of drive to both in terms of policy, both in terms of market push for more and more data-driven initiatives, where, you know, we are seeing every single data initiative's algorithm and as a sort of technological fix of a sort of range of problems that we have in society. And these so we're witnessing sort of this on the one hand, and on the other hand, we're starting to witness the sort of more discussions around the sustainability around this initiative. So although we're not tackling this in a way, and, you know, that is efficient, and I feel that, you know, the dawn of 5G technology and the constant demand that we're having at the moment around data infrastructures. So we really need to make sure that we are talking about this. I mean, take, for example, the COVID-19, you know, the emergency that we're going through. So we have calls for remote working. Obviously, they do help the environment. They help reduce the environmental impact of traveling to work, but also we never had, over the last few years, discussions around the excessive energy consumption and sort of the environmental destruction that all these sort of digital services rely upon. I think over the last few years, we have seen a lot of discussions around ethics in artificial intelligence, and I think a lot of us have grown, although realizing the importance of all of this. I think I think we've all realized that artificial intelligence needs to be conceptualized as a sort of social experiment that we're conducting on society, and is, to an extent, if it's a social experiment we're conducting on society, we'll still have a lot to learn about, especially when it comes to protecting the people and protecting the planet and what it means for it to be sustainable from a social justice perspective and environmental perspectives and all of that. And also, I think what we're seeing at the moment, especially in some areas, is that we're seeing this sort of more attention coming. For example, if I think about sort of from a business perspective, we've seen a lot of corporations becoming sort of greener, employing sustainability advocates, increasing renewable energy supply to respond to the demand coming from civil society. And to an extent, we are at risk of running in that regard, the same risk that we've been to an extent witnessing within the ethics field, the ethics washing of companies that are appearing ethical rather than acting ethically. To an extent, these initiatives could be in some cases considered as an attempt to greenwashing, and therefore, how do we critically assess all of this? And I think as somebody who spends sort of time working in as a sort of chief global privacy officer for an organization, for me, my main point is when I work with the technical teams, when we evaluate the project, when we look at all of this, for me, it's always how to make sure that, how do I not fall into the trap of ethics being sort of subsumed into company logics and business practices. And I'm not talking about my company, obviously, but I'm talking about the wider picture. And for me, the main issue is how do we incorporate the issue of sustainability within this? And how do we make sure that when sort of that we have the sustainability in the wider sense, from a social justice, from an environmental impact, does not get absorbed into sort of the corporate affairs mantle of organization without companies really addressing the business strategies and processes. And to me, this is the sort of the largest risk that we're running at the moment, as we defined. How sort of what is the wider what we continue to define what is the wider sustainability framework around sort of artificial intelligence, especially from an environmental perspective. And to me, sort of for example, companies developing artificial intelligence models and introducing things like carbon trackers, or they that those are ideas that I would be very much in favor of exploring. But how we are able to create a discourse between sort of business, civil society, and institutions on a wider framework around sort of sustainability, which does not end up in a sort of with the same fate, that the ethics debate has had, which gets incorporated into the corporate affairs policies and the PR and mantle of organizations. To me, this is the challenge that I see moving forward.
Thank you very much, Eva, for your interesting perspective and also for raising awareness on the risk connected to, for instance, greenwashing and other practices. Because indeed, as myself as a consumer, sometimes I tend to look for services that appear to be greener, to be more compliant with data protection, but somehow, how can I understand if what companies are promising me is real or if they are doing marketing washing? A problem that I have found sometimes is that there are not, from an environmental point of view, there are not uniform standards to evaluate whether something is or not, because some analysis may be based just for, I don't know, water consumption or emission or supply chain and so on, but finding something that could allow to have a broader picture is very, very much challenging. So thank you very much for pointing this out. So now that we have broken the ice, I would like to give back the floor to Ben to understand if he wants to react a bit of what the other speakers say. I would like to do another tour de table if possible, if you want to add something and discuss that. Also, to the public, if you have questions and comments, just type them in the chat and then we can give the floor to you after this second tour de table.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree with what Ben said. I mean, I'm not. My comments about the nature of human rights for the individual was not in any way to denigrate them, but I mean the importance of the right to human dignity cannot ever be disputed, and it's at the core of what we care about. The limitation is indeed how they can be used as a basis for resolving more systemic problems that we have. Recital 4 of the GDPR says that the personal data processing should be designed to serve mankind, and that's almost a radical statement for an instrument which deals with personal data protection, and it's commendable, and it gives you context. But the sad reality is that the GDPR is not easily leveraged in order to assert collective rights and to combat harm that has been done to groups collectively. So there was a piece in The Economist in 2020. They have this series of articles called The World If, where they try to imagine how things might evolve in a kind of plausible future. And it was entitled something like what if every carbon emission was tracked, or something like that. And it basically was a sort of liberal fantasy about everyone through their smartphones and apps being able to monitor with great precision their environmental footprint of everything that they do. In other words, what every transaction that they make, and then it sort of slips into the inevitable. It's going to be privacy versus green. It's going to be privacy versus environmental protection, because you're going to have your visit to Starbucks made publicly available on Instagram and so on. And if you resist that, then somehow you're not contributing to the wider imperative of reducing carbon emissions. The fallacy there is that, again, there's no sense of scale. I mean, the individual actions are important, but they're not the thing that are going to. Individual choices by consumers are not the thing that's going to bend the curve of global warming and biodiversity loss, etc. So there are. Someone mentioned, Giancarlo mentioned Amazon at the beginning, I think, or at least quoted that I think it was Elettra Bietti's article. So the idea is that there are massive corporations, including in tech, where they are, they often invest in green technology, or their servers, the big tech companies, they tend to be the most energy efficient. But at the same time, they're facilitating fossil fuel extraction. And what we've been doing, my colleagues in the Commission, DG Environment in particular, we're monitoring the efficiency of data centers in Europe, and unfortunately, this is an area of tension here, because with the Schrems II judgment, with geopolitical hostilities growing, and perhaps never as much as now in Europe for many decades, there is now a trend, a market trend, if not a regulatory one, for data to be stored in Europe. But Europe tends to have the least efficient cloud servers, so that's going to be a problem. So what that means is that we need to try to find a way of connecting the environmental impact of data practices with the impact on individual privacy, and that's where the principle of data minimization can be instructive, and that's what we were thinking in EDPS, and I think they still are considering this. So, but we don't really see much interaction between these different players. We don't really see a dialogue between data protection authorities and environmental groups. That's something that's the beginning of this dialogue is absolutely imperative now. One last thing to say is that the going back to this atomization thing, and that individual consumers need to be nudged into making the right decisions. If you look at the sustainability and circularity of many products, you'll see that it's very different depending on the product category. So with desktop computers, most of the footprint of your desktop computer is when it's being used, whereas the footprint, the environmental impact of a smartphone tends to be front loaded. And so by the time you receive your new iPhone in its packaging, the bulk of the footprint in terms of resource extraction, carbon emissions, etc., that has already been it's already been lost before you even start to use it. So these are the sorts of things that we need to be thinking through, and there needs to be a much more consistent and coherent dialogue between those of us who are working in the data in the human rights area and those who are working in to try to reduce environmental impacts of business practices. Because if we don't do that, we're going to end up with the scenario that The Economist was fantasizing about, which is there's going to be this phony war between protecting individual privacy and reversing environmental degradation.
Thank you very much, Christian, and thank you also for raising the point about the environmental impact to a certain extent of the Schrems II judgment, because I mean it's something that maybe it's not so straightforward to think how new market models based on storing data within, let's say, the board of the European Union could affect also the environmental sustainability of practices. So on the one hand, I could think that maybe this could be a push for European companies to enhance their environmental sustainability, but yes, indeed, that's a good point. Also, thank you for stressing the points of the lack of coordination between data and environmental data protection and environmental protection authorities, because indeed it's a topic that I have directly experience on, because I researched on, for example, the coordination between e-waste management and data protection, and I've realized that when you read maybe the waste management directive and so on, there are no reference to the data protection challenges raised by e-waste. And I think this, at least for me, it's a huge problem, because here is another tension between, let's say, the environmental field and the data protection field, because, well, let's think about disposing computers. I mean, I would not trust this in my computer if I'm not sure that any information is deleted from them. Also, second-hand market. How can I trust a second-hand market if I'm not sure how the data treated in case I forget something? But sorry, Ivan, I give the floor to you, and then we can go ahead with.
Thank you so much, and I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things. So the first one is the risk that we're running, which I agree, of setting privacy versus sort of sustainability and sort of the individual right to privacy and the wider sustainability element. This is really important, especially with a big push that we're seeing on privacy enhancing technologies and their huge computational power that they require. I'm thinking about differential privacy, and so the huge element in this. And I wouldn't, and I wouldn't want to end up in a situation where we have to pitch privacy against, the computing power and energy requirements. Then these technologies, data consuming and power consuming technologies to enhance privacy. And I do wonder whether, I mean, to me, there are several issues here. So the first one is, how some principles can be leveraged, you know. So I'm thinking, for example, of some myths that we're having at the moment in the AI field. The field, for example, the idea, you know, that we need to collect as much data as possible. And now there is a very strong counter push to that, in relation to, is it true that we need to collect this much, or do we need better quality data? Do we need a data-centric approach, not just an approach to say we collect as much as we can? A second element is with all the sort of the trade-offs that may be needed, but you know, synthetic data could prove really useful when in moving forward. And the issue of data minimization was brought forward, but I also wonder how the human in the loop element could support a new way of handling data in the AI field. By that I mean, could, for example, combining human intelligence with the artificial kind of intelligence, could that help in creating better data? Do we really need to, I mean, a lot of the sort of the preparation of the data sets and the data sheets that we need, a lot of this can be done manually. And so I wonder whether, you know, having more human intervention in a way that is more meaningful could be something that we want to push from an environmental perspective. I mean, obviously, when it comes to sort of the environmental aspects of all this, it's something that, you know, scaringly we have not considered. And you know, over the last few years, we've had the mantra that AI can be used for sustainability, that AI can help us maximize the resources in the grid, the AI can be the savior of the environment. During COP26, it was almost scary. You know, everybody was talking about how artificial intelligence can help us save the problem of the environment. You know, what are we going to do without AI? And the issue is that, again, you know, this is the sort of the techno-chauvinist approach, you know, whereby AI is going to solve the problem of the environment, which it isn't. It can contribute, obviously, but we also have to take into consideration the dramatic impact that AI itself has on the environment. So I think it's sort of, that is a discussion that you know, that absolutely we have to have, including when it comes to, for example, when at the time when we're discussing the AI Act, where at the time we're discussing sort of the regulatory options around the world, you know, on artificial intelligence. I mean, can we imagine a proportionality framework? So something that assesses whether training or, you know, tuning of an AI model for a particular task is proportional to the carbon footprint and the general impact that the artificial intelligence may have on the environment. And this is particularly important. And of course, this is, you know, I wouldn't want to end up in a situation where we turn into the individual to make a choice of choosing something which is more, you know, environmentally friendly, or of course there is that, you know, there is that sort of shift in public opinions. We've seen this, you know, that we've seen this with many different aspects from its particular relation to the environment. By the way, as Christian was saying, an individual is not going to use a product instead of another when we tell him about the environmental impact, because of many different reasons, including lack of competition. But what I'm trying to say here is that we need to get different areas to work together on an idea of proportionality, of sustainability, that encompasses different elements, you know, so and the environment has to be one of those. But I am really concerned by the fact that, you know, we've been sold this idea that AI is going to solve the problem of the environment, that is going to really be the silver bullet that, you know, that it allows us to do all the sort of to resolve all the issues that we had ahead. And I do wonder, you know, in now that we are having all these discussions about the AI Act and governance, and I don't see yet much of this included in these conversations. And I mean, ultimately, especially on the environment, that is the most challenging thing that we had moving forward. And so I do wonder what needs to be done and what can be done to put these issues top of the agenda.
Thank you very much, Ivana. Indeed, completely agree. I have realized as well, okay, I'm not an expert of all the proposals that are on the table, of course, but indeed there is this leitmotif that data sharing, artificial intelligence, everything is gonna be there to save the environment. So indeed, we have this juxtaposition position to a certain extent between protection of data, not necessarily personal data, indeed, because this is another important aspect, and environmental protection. And I really like your point about the man in the loop. It's something that came out also in the previous intervention of Ben and Christian. And what I have noticed as well is that, we overall say that involving human in the loop could be useful and everything. We admit that the GDPR does not make a lot of effort to include public participation, public consultation of individuals. The problem is that maybe we could have expected that in the upcoming regulation on artificial intelligence, on data governance and so on, this public participation aspect could have been further deployed, but it's not really like that. So, a question that I want to raise to all the speakers: why do you think it's like that? What are the reasons that do not allow public participation to be included? So maybe Ben wants to go ahead, and then Christian, and then Ivana again.
Zero-sum game rather than a multi-sum game. We're not good at playing these zero-sum games unless we have clear boundaries and clear alignments. What are the collective rules? What are the limitations? What are the things that we accept that are appropriate? And where do we then have to say, okay, this goes beyond what we would normally accept?
Much better. So, Christian.
Yeah, listening to Ben, I was thinking of that there's a study cited by David Wallace Wells in his book on the uninhabitable Earth, where citing a 2018 study which predicted that within a year or two, the energy consumption required by Bitcoin would exceed the energy gains through switching to solar panels. So in other words, similar to Ben's example of cars, we're trying to make efficiency gains by the use of technology and immediately cancelling them out by our quest for new and innovative and exciting technologies and applications. So it is a question of governance. I think it's a question of waste. There's an example. You could argue that artificial intelligence is an integral part of real-time bidding and programmatic advertising, and it's something that I'm working on in the Commission, a study on ad tech and its impact on privacy, but also other externalities, including the environment. And this entire ecosystem of online advertising generates phenomenal amounts of data and distribution of data to thousands of intermediaries. It comes, as we all know, at an enormous cost to privacy. According to the Belgian Privacy Authority 2 weeks ago, the existing consent framework for this process under the auspices of the IAB is illegal under the GDPR, and at the same time, it's incredibly wasteful. Bob Hoffman wrote a blog a few weeks ago where he has an image of what he calls the programmatic poop funnel, and he says that I know that 97% of my programmatic ad budget is wasted. I just don't know which 97%. Now, in other words, is the price that we're paying in terms of privacy and environment worth it when most of the value from advertising is not going to publishers or to advertisers at all? And this is an industry which is responsible for 160 million tons of CO2 in online advertising, and an estimated 23% of that is just invalid traffic. In other words, it's just fraudulent ad traffic. So we do have a major problem here. There is, there's this notion of green jacketing digital technologies. So when a technology is invested in, it needs to be given parameters for how it will develop. We have, in the form of the GDPR, some rules on what can be done with data, and then the question is, well, is this actually being enforced? Is it making a difference? But the same applies in terms of the environmental impact of these different technologies. So one last thing to say is that I think there are some applications of AI technology which are incredibly promising, but somehow we've got into a loop of assuming that AI is about, what we say in the manifesto, decoding and recoding the human brain. So it's all about trying to nudge people, trying to manipulate them into doing things, to buying things, not to behave in a certain way. Whereas the potential for AI is to track non-personal things, the pollution, image recognition in relation to resources. There's an enormous amount that can be done, and yet, if you follow the discussions on the AI Act, it's all about human facial recognition. So our priorities are all completely wrong, and we need to try to. This is another way that we can try to integrate the discourses of environmental protection and human rights.
Thank you very much, Ivana. The floor.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, Christian, with what you're saying. I mean, to me, there are, I mean, the number one issue in this that we're facing at the moment is the lack of data that we've got about it, right? I mean, I don't think that we have publicly available information about the environmental impact, and I don't think large companies will do voluntary disclosures. I was reading Crawford, and the ethics of AI, and there was really few incentives for companies to release any information about it, around sort of the global supply chain and the global environmental impact. Now, the issue that we're facing, I think, is that as was mentioned, that there is a greater understanding, I think, now. I mean, it is more acknowledged, that artificial intelligence and data centers, cloud computing, and they do have a heavy footprint, and high consumption of sort of non-renewable energy, waste production, carbon dioxide emissions. This is becoming sort of more relevant and more acknowledged. However, and this is why I was saying, I would very much like, can we have a proportionality test? Can we look at, in the context we're in, so this constant push for more and more data-driven initiatives, but can we have a sort of a proportionality test? Can we have when we look at the consequences, intended, unintended consequences, although I don't like that unintended is just because there are not enough people around the table to define, but of using AI technologies compared to not using them, right? So, for example, what does the AI do? Does it improve the well-being of the population, or are some minority groups excluded? What does the impact of the AI on ethical, social, cultural, environmental, legal, and economic aspects? And of course, this requires the stakeholder engagement at sort of at very early phase. And I do think honestly that what I would like to see is a bigger push on solutions when it comes to this, and for as difficult as it is. So we mentioned, the issue around the possibility of relying more on synthetic data, the combining human intelligence with artificial intelligence more in the issues around sort of the data minimization. I am, thinking about the how do companies and how can we include reporting on computational costs, of training algorithms as part of the transparency discussions that we're having. How do we do in Europe, for example, to increase research in forms of artificial intelligence that are less data hungry than machine learning. For example, things like automated reasoning, because that means, less use of personal data and energy consumption. Why do we have all this focus on exactly sort of the personal data and things that are, for example, looking at the ad tech ecosystem rather than looking at things that do not need they do not need personal data. The issue of synthetic data for me is really important. For example, in medical fields, data can be discarded, doesn't need to be stored. Can we push for investment? Can we have more investment into this? And I think it's really important that we bring together these two elements. This sort of the AI for sustainability, which is promising, and it has very promising element. But that cannot go disjuncted from this sustainable AI. So how do we merge this sort of two debates together? I think is something that we have to do as soon as possible.
Thank you very much, Ivana. Great way to conclude this panel, because now we are opening the Q&A session. So I don't see now in the chat any questions yet, but perhaps Gian Claudio collects something now I see one. So, sorry, let me just, I don't think that this person can intervene, or maybe Gian Claudio, can you open the floor?
Yeah, I think that people that are interacting are students, because when you see the surname written in capital. So let me.
Okay. Perfect.
I think you can read the question, the first two. Yeah.
Okay.
And so, thank you.
The purpose behind the use of data or artificial intelligence seems key for sustainability aspects. How would you assess the legal ban of data collection for certain purposes, like advertisement and so on? Who wants to go ahead?
Maybe I would collect 3 of them.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, we'll go ahead reading the questions. So, in the age of data, where even governments are violating the data privacy of their citizens, do you see the possibility of an international court trust which could help people settle the data privacy issues involving powerful companies and governments on an international scale, not just Europe? Third question, when you say blockchain is more sustainable, is it really? Considering the major environmental impact of crypto is the electricity required for the mining purposes. So is it really saving energy? So these are the 3 questions that we have now. Maybe I can start with Ben if he wants to reply to one of the questions. Perhaps we can respect the order of before, Christian and then Ivana, if they want to address one of more.
Those are big questions, and yeah, I mean, ban on data collection. That's something which is in the within the competencies of data protection authorities in Europe and elsewhere. If a particular activity is harmful, it's very difficult to do, particularly if you want to group various data processing operations into one thing, like advertising or targeted advertising or tracking But you know, I mean, there are a lot of data protection authorities who say openly that, you know, the future is to prohibit certain uses of data rather than trying to impose sanctions, which, if you're a massive, you know, one of the biggest companies in the world, sanctions are not even going to make an impression on your revenue. International action, I can't see that happening. I mean, there are various initiatives, particularly from Japan, the notion of data flows with trust, but it's not, the approaches to data around the world are very, very fragmented. I would just add one thing. I mean, I'm not here to advocate blockchain, but there is one initiative which is going to come out of the European Commission in the next few weeks, called the Sustainable Product Initiative regulation, which will include it will provide a basis for what we call digital product passports, and these will be basically chips that will, like RFID chips, which are potentially included in every item, every resource and material towards a product, to enable citizens and governments and actors on the supply chain to see how sustainable and circular the resources are, as the resources are being used as the product comes together. And there is a view that blockchain technology can assist in that. But yes, I mean, a number of applications of blockchain are horrendously wasteful when it comes to energy consumption.
I'm happy to move to the next questions if you.
Okay, that's fine. So we have other three questions. One, it's about how we can decrease the possible bias and increase the fairness when using AI in our daily life. Is there a sustainable way to do so? For example, would it be possible to have public and private collaboration in the algorithm elaboration of private companies? So do you feel comfortable with this?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. So, I mean, the issue of bias has both a sort of a technical and non-technical answer. You know, there is no. It's hard to find a technological fix to something which is so ingrained in our society, and to an extent, you know, it's the base that we're running is for it to be automated and sort of and end up in software. You know, the origin of bias are so different. You know, they are part of. They can come from data that is not being massaged and properly. It could come from the parameters that are chosen, where the algorithm is trained and then deployed. So obviously there are a number of technical solutions that can support bias spotting and identifying sort of where the bias may come from, and then, you know, to be able to put a sort of technological fix. Although I mean, I'm deeply concerned about the idea that we can sort of that a technological fix will be the answer to the whole thing, and this is why this is an area, for example, where what we're worried about is not just sort of bias that. To an extent, bias is we all are biased. What we're worried about is where that bias becomes stereotype and becomes prejudice and gets, you know, into the software, and then it scales up and automate what we already have as existing sort of inequalities in society. So I think it's the combination of technical and non-technical measures, and involving people from sort of different backgrounds to understand where potential discrimination may come from. So I think bias in AI is one of the most sort of discussed and heated up discussions that we're having at the moment, but it's rightly so, because it's a risk for everyone.
Okay, thank you very much, Ivan. I'm sorry, I think we are running out of time, and I know that Gian Claudio wants to ask a question, so I will give the floor to him now.
It's totally abuse of my position. I'm sorry. No, I wanted just to ask a question, and then we'll wrap up for 1 minute conclusion. Basically, I think that there is a dialogue already possible here in terms of legal terms, right? We have the data protection impact assessment asking to assess the impact of fundamental rights. And the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights has Article 37 about environment as a collective value. Of course, it's not an individual right, but it's in the charter that is related. So maybe this is a question also for Christian that is in the EU institutions. Can we use the data protection impact assessment to prevent, as a way to protect the environment? And on the other hand, I will take a question that was made at the beginning to say also the opposite. Can we use data as a a corporate social responsibility goal, right? So could we use the tools that are typical of environmental sustainability to protect also data, and the tool that is typical of data protection, that is DPIA, to protect also the environment? Because that would be a way that also when we plan a privacy enhancing technology, we assess the impact on the environment, for example. I don't know if this is too difficult to do in practice, and I don't know what our speakers think about that. I see that Christian was replying, and yeah, yes, yeah.
Thanks. I think the obvious area is the principle of data minimization. The GDPR is the data protection rules don't stop you from processing data, but they are supposed to give controllers a reflex to think about what they're doing before they do it, and to avoid using personal data if they don't need to. So if that principle were really implemented, and it obviously isn't implemented in the real world, then you could expect to see a much lower carbon footprint from ICT. I think that should be obvious, and it's in that respect that I think there needs to be, I'd love to hear DPAs talking about being carbon neutral by 2030. Leading by example, and I'd love to see some sort of collaboration between civil liberties NGOs and environmental campaigners, because I think there are obvious synergies there, but whether the GDPR itself could be used to I'm not sure. I can't see it personally, because it really is the idea of the GDPR is, you as an individual have rights if your data is being processed, and if you're processing someone else's data, then you have obligations.
Thank you very much, Christian. So if some of the other speakers want to add a flash comment on this very last point, because afterwards
Alessandra, I just wanted to add one thing to what Gian Claudio. I think there is. The point Gian Claudio is making is really important. But to be honest, for me, what I would like to see is to me there's a really clear, important political choice here to be made, which is around understanding and be clear that, yes, of course, artificial intelligence can play a big part in solving a lot of the problems that we've got in the environment as well. But at the same, and especially in terms of optimization of what we've got at the moment, but also the recognition has to be clear around the potential damage that we're having. This is a political discussion that needs to happen. We need to understand that, because we still live in this sort of idea of the technological fixes and how, this techno-chauvinism that artificial intelligence is going to solve all problems. So first is a political understanding of this. Second, it's really debunking some of the myths. There is a lot of really interesting stuff happening at the moment around the idea that you do not need this huge amount of data, that we need smart-sized, data-centric solutions to big issues in artificial intelligence. Andrew Ng, who was one of the pioneers in artificial intelligence, he said it really clearly. Do we still need all this amount of data, or can we move on to something else? Can we, in European Union, push towards stronger research in the area of for example, synthetic data? And can we integrate better human and non-human intelligence? So what I'm trying to say is that this is a really important discussion that needs to happen. And what I'm saying is, when it comes to evaluate the harms and the benefits of artificial intelligence, the kind of proportionality test that we have, the understanding of the environment, in my view, needs to be a very important part of all this. And I'm not seeing this happening yet. I'm not seeing that a wider sustainability discussions that we're having. So in terms of really impact that we can steps that we can take. I would very much like to see a deeper integration between these discussions between different areas, but how we operationalize this, for example, by saying let's invest more in synthetic data, let's look at things that help us reduce the amount of data that we need, and debunk the myths that the data collection and collecting as much as possible is the only way that we have forward. This is very much of a political outcome that we need to achieve.
Thank you very much, Ivana. So unless Ben has a very, very last remark, I don't know. Everything. Now I'm entrusting my moderation right to Gian Claudio for a very telegraphic comment to conclude the debate of today. Thank you very much again to our amazing guests and to the audience for the question.
Yeah, I was just to say thank you again to Alessandra on behalf of the Hub. She was wonderful, and all our speakers, just to two take homes. So the challenges ahead. So now I'm proposing the topics for Data Sustainability Conference 2023, which is maybe building on what Ivana was suggesting. We should select privacy enhancing technologies on the basis of their impact. Maybe differential privacy is environmentally problematic, while other, like synthetic data, human-in-the-loop systems might be better. Also, we should convince, also building on what Christian and Ben were saying, how to ensure individuals' participation in practice, how data and environment, data protection and environment protection are not enemies, but are allies, and we can use similar tools for them. And privacy and economic efficiency can be friends rather than enemies. So all this, a lot to discuss. More questions than answers, but I'm extremely grateful because, this was not like a 100 people, 100 attendees event, because the topic is extremely new, but we are building something together. I'm sure that next year we will do this. So I think you can enjoy the applause from my students. And thank you again. Bye-bye, everyone.